Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour, where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, but still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off, or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this kind of calm historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. The life of a medieval blacksmith was one of contradictions. Revered for their seemingly magical ability to transform raw iron into the tools that kept civilization functioning, yet scorned for the very fire and smoke that made their craft possible. They were the backbone of medieval technology, crafting everything from the nails that held together humble cottages to the mighty swords that decided the fate of kingdoms. Yet their existence was marked by a brutality that would be almost incomprehensible to us today. Let us begin with young Thomas, apprentice to Master Edmund the blacksmith in the village of Millbrook. At barely 14 years of age, Thomas rises each morning in the grey hour before dawn, his small body already bearing the scars and calluses that mark his trade. The workshop is a cavern of shadows and dancing flames, where the great bellows wheeze like some slumbering dragon, and the forge glows with an angry red eye that never truly sleeps. The air is thick with smoke that burns the lungs and stings the eyes. There are no windows in this place, for glass is a luxury far beyond the means of a village blacksmith, and the few openings in the stone walls do little to clear the suffocating atmosphere. Thomas has learned to breathe shallowly, to move through the haze like a ghost, his young lungs already beginning to show the damage that will plague him for whatever years remain of his life. The heat is perhaps the most relentless enemy. In summer, the forge turns the workshop into a furnace that rivals the depths of hell itself. Temperatures soar beyond human endurance, yet the work cannot stop. Iron must be heated to precise temperatures, shaped while it glows with malleability, and cooled at exactly the right moment. There is no respite from the blazing heat that radiates from the coals, no escape from the waves of scorching air that seem to steal the very breath from one's lungs. Master Edmund, now in his 40th year, which makes him ancient by medieval standards, bears the accumulated damage of decades at the forge. His face is a landscape of burns and scars, his eyebrows long since singed away by countless sparks and flashes of superheated metal. His hands, those tools of his trade, are gnarled things, more scar tissue than flesh, the fingerprints long since burned away by red-hot iron and molten metal. The work begins before sunrise and continues until darkness makes it impossible to see the colour of heated metal. There are no weekends, no holidays, save for the most sacred feast days, when even the church acknowledges that some rest is necessary for the soul. Every day brings the same brutal routine, lighting the forge, heating the iron, hammering, shaping, cooling, and beginning again. The process of making even the simplest nail is a testament to the harsh realities of medieval craftsmanship. Thomas must first heat the iron rod in the forge until it glows cherry red, a process that requires him to work the great leather bellows with his entire body weight, pumping air into the coals until they roar with white-hot intensity. The heat that radiates from this inferno is so intense that it can singe hair and eyebrows from several feet away. Once the iron reaches the proper temperature, Thomas must quickly withdraw it with long-handled tongs and place it on the anvil. Here, Master Edmund takes over with his heavy hammer, striking the glowing metal with precise, powerful blows that send showers of sparks cascading through the smoky air. Each spark is a tiny fragment of molten metal, and they fall like burning rain onto any exposed skin, leaving behind a constellation of small burns and blisters. The rhythm of the hammer is hypnotic yet punishing. Strike, turn, strike, turn, each blow shaping the iron while it remains malleable. But iron cools quickly, and if the work takes too long, the metal must be returned to the forge and reheated, beginning the cycle anew. This constant race against cooling metal means that every movement must be efficient, every blow calculated, every second precious. The tools of the blacksmith's trade are themselves instruments of hardship. The hammer, weighing anywhere from 2 to 4 pounds, must be wielded with precision for hours on end. By the end of a long day, the smith's arm feels as though it might fall from his shoulder, the muscles cramped and aching from the repetitive motion. The tongs, essential for handling hot metal, become extensions of hands that are already battered and burned, their metal handles conducting heat that adds to the smith's suffering. But perhaps most treacherous of all is the anvil itself. This massive block of iron, weighing several hundred pounds, sits at the perfect height to destroy a man's back over years of bending and hammering. The smith must lean over this unyielding surface for hours each day, his spine compressed and twisted as he works. Many smiths develop a characteristic stoop, their bodies permanently bent from decades of this punishing posture. The dangers of the forge extend far beyond mere discomfort. Fire is a constant threat in a world built largely of wood and thatch. A single stray spark can ignite the straw that covers the workshop floor or catch in the timber beams overhead. More than one smith has watched helplessly as his livelihood, and sometimes his life, went up in flames. The village of Millbrook still bears the scars of the Great Fire of 1241, when Master Edmund's predecessor allowed his forge to burn too hot, sending sparks into the thatched roof and ultimately consuming half the village in the resulting blaze. The smoke itself is a silent killer, filling the lungs with particles of coal dust and metal filings that accumulate over years of exposure. Medieval smiths often developed a characteristic cough, a harsh rattling sound that spoke of lungs slowly being destroyed by their trade. Many did not live to see their 50th year, their bodies worn out by the constant assault of heat, smoke, and physical strain. Yet for all these hardships, the blacksmith occupied a position of crucial importance in medieval society. Without his skills, the entire fabric of civilization would have unraveled. Farmers could not tend their fields without iron plowshares and hoes. Carpenters could not build without nails and hinges. Warriors could not fight without swords and armor. The blacksmith was the bridge between the raw materials that the earth provided and the tools that humanity needed to survive and prosper. This essential nature of their work gave blacksmiths a peculiar position in the rigid social hierarchy of medieval times. They were not nobility, certainly, and they ranked below the merchants and skilled craftsmen who worked in more pleasant trades. Yet they were far above the common labourers and serfs who worked the land. A blacksmith owned his tools, chose his projects within the constraints of local demand, and often accumulated modest wealth over the course of his career. The relationship between a blacksmith and his community was complex and sometimes fraught with tension. The villagers needed his services desperately, yet they also feared the fire and smoke that marked his presence. In an age when most people lived in terror of flames that could destroy everything they owned in a matter of minutes, the blacksmith's forge was seen as both a necessity and a threat. Some communities required smiths to build their workshops outside the village proper, far enough away that a fire would not spread to other buildings. The apprenticeship system that governed the blacksmith's trade was itself a form of institutionalized brutality. Young boys, often as young as 12 or 13, were bound to master smiths for periods of 7 years or more. During this time, they were essentially slaves, working without pay in exchange for training and the promise of eventual freedom to practice the trade on their own. Young Thomas represents thousands of such apprentices who endured years of backbreaking labor, constant danger, and frequent abuse at the hands of masters who saw them as little more than additional tools to be used and discarded. The apprentice slept on the floor of the workshop, often with only a thin blanket between his body and the cold stone. He ate the scraps that remained after the master and his family had finished their meals, and he worked from dawn to dusk with little rest and no prospect of escape. The learning process was brutal in its simplicity. There were no textbooks, no formal instruction, no gentle guidance into the mysteries of the craft. An apprentice learned by watching, by making mistakes, and by enduring the painful consequences of those mistakes. A moment's inattention could result in severe burns, crushed fingers, or worse. Many apprentices bore permanent scars from their years of training, marks that would remind them for the rest of their lives of the price they had paid to learn their trade. The social isolation of the blacksmith was another burden that weighed heavily on those who practiced the craft. The noise, smoke, and fire of the forge made it impossible to work in close proximity to other trades. While weavers might work side by side, sharing conversation and companionship, the blacksmith labored largely alone, with only his apprentices for company. The constant noise of hammering made conversation difficult, and the dangerous nature of the work demanded complete concentration. This isolation was compounded by the superstitions that surrounded the blacksmith's craft. In an age when most people understood little about the natural world, the ability to transform solid iron into useful tools seemed almost magical. Some viewed blacksmiths with suspicion, wondering if their mastery over fire and metal came from unholy sources. Others saw them as possessing knowledge that bordered on the supernatural, consulting them not only for metalwork, but for charms and remedies that had nothing to do with their actual skills. The economic reality of a blacksmith's life was as harsh as the physical demands of the trade. While a successful smith could achieve a modest level of prosperity, the path to success was fraught with obstacles. Iron was expensive, and a smith often had to invest his own limited resources in raw materials before he could create the finished products that would provide his income. A single mistake, a piece of iron ruined by overheating or poor technique, could represent a significant financial loss. The seasonal nature of agricultural work meant that demand for the blacksmith's services fluctuated dramatically throughout the year. During planting and harvest seasons, farmers desperately needed tools repaired or replaced, and a smith might work 18-hour days to meet the demand. But during the long winter months, when agricultural work slowed to a crawl, the blacksmith might struggle to find enough work to feed his family. Competition between smiths could be fierce, particularly in larger towns where multiple craftsmen practiced the same trade. A reputation for quality work was essential, but it took years to build and could be destroyed by a single substandard piece. Smiths guarded their techniques jealously, passing down secrets through generations and viewing other smiths as potential threats to their livelihood. The guild system that governed many medieval trades offered some protection and regulation, but it also imposed strict controls on who could practice the craft and how. A smith who was not a member of the local guild might find himself unable to work legally, while guild membership often required substantial fees and adherence to rules that limited innovation and competition. The guilds could be as much a burden as a blessing, particularly for younger smiths trying to establish themselves in the trade. As our young Thomas progresses through his apprenticeship, we see in his story the broader tale of countless medieval craftsmen who endured similar hardships. His hands, once smooth and unmarked, become a map of his trade, crossed with burns and cuts that tell the story of his learning. His body, once straight and strong, begins to bend under the constant strain of his labor. His lungs, once clear and healthy, begin to wheeze with the accumulated damage of years spent breathing smoke and metal dust. Yet Thomas persists, as did thousands like him, driven by the knowledge that his craft, however brutal, offered one of the few paths to modest prosperity and social mobility available to a boy of humble birth. The alternative, a life of agricultural labor as a serf bound to the land, offered even less hope and perhaps even greater hardship. The medieval blacksmith's workshop was a place where the raw materials of the earth were transformed into the tools of civilization. But it was also a place where human bodies and spirits were tested to their very limits. It was a realm of fire and iron, of sweat and blood, where the price of progress was measured in suffering and sacrifice. As we leave young Thomas to his labors and Master Edmund to his endless cycle of heating and hammering, we carry with us an understanding of the true cost of the medieval world's technological achievements. Every nail, every horseshoe, every sword and plowshare represented not just the transformation of iron into useful objects, but the transformation of human lives into something harder and more enduring than the metal they worked. The blacksmith's forge was indeed the beating heart of medieval civilization, but it was a heart that pumped not just the lifeblood of progress, but the very essence of human endurance in the face of unimaginable hardship. In the dancing flames and ringing anvils of these workshops, we see reflected the broader story of medieval life itself. Brutal, unforgiving, yet somehow magnificent in its stubborn refusal to surrender to the darkness. Rest well, dear listener, and let the gentle rhythm of distant hammers lull you into peaceful dreams, knowing that the struggles of these long-ago craftsmen have given way to a world where such suffering is no longer the price of progress. Based on the reference videos and your previous work, here's part 2 of Life as a Medieval Blacksmith Was Brutal, Boring History for Sleep. The forge stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its stones still radiating warmth from yesterday's labors. Soon, Thomas would stoke the coals once more, and the familiar symphony of hammer on anvil would echo through the village. But for now, in these quiet moments before the world stirred, we can examine more closely the intricate web of relationships that bound the medieval blacksmith to his community, and the slow transformation of both craft and craftsman over the centuries. The relationship between blacksmith and village was far more complex than simple commerce. Edmund's forge served as an unofficial gathering place, a nexus where news travelled and alliances formed. When the harvest failed, farmers would arrive not just seeking repairs to their tools, but hoping for credit, for understanding, for time to pay. Edmund, his own survival tied to theirs, would extend what grace he could, knowing that a dead customer served no one. Yet this interdependence bred its own tensions. The blacksmith's essential role granted him a certain security, but it also made him a target for resentment. When times were hard and iron scarce, villagers might whisper that Edmund hoarded the precious metal, that he charged too much for his services. During outbreaks of disease, some would eye the forge's hellish glow with suspicion, wondering if the smith's commerce with fire had attracted darker forces. The medieval mind saw connections everywhere, and the blacksmith's dominion over flame placed him at the intersection of the sacred and the profane. Fire was both creator and destroyer, the force that transformed raw ore into useful tools, but also the element that consumed homes and lives. This duality shadowed every blacksmith's reputation. While respected for their skill, they were also regarded with a mixture of awe and unease. Thomas learned early that managing these perceptions was as crucial as managing the forge itself. A blacksmith who appeared too prosperous might face accusations of greed or witchcraft. One who seemed too poor might be deemed incompetent. The successful smith walked a careful line, displaying enough skill to command respect while maintaining the humble demeanor expected of a craftsman. The guild system that emerged in larger towns and cities during the later medieval period brought both opportunities and constraints to the blacksmith's world. These associations of craftsmen promised protection, standardized training, and regulated competition. For a smith like Edmund, membership in a guild could mean access to better materials, established trade routes, and a voice in municipal affairs. But guild membership came with its own shackles. Strict regulations governed everything from the quality of iron used to the prices that could be charged. Apprenticeship periods were extended and formalized, sometimes lasting 7 years or more. The guilds jealously guarded their secrets and their markets, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to practice the trade legally. Young Thomas, had he lived in a guild town, would have found his path to mastery far more structured, but also more constrained. Guild apprentices lived under their master's roof, bound by contracts that governed not just their work, but their personal conduct. They could not marry without permission, could not leave their master's service before their term was complete, and were forbidden from learning the trade's deeper mysteries until deemed ready by their superiors. The guild system also introduced new hierarchies within the craft itself. Master smiths who could afford the fees and demonstrate their expertise gained the right to take apprentices and sell their wares freely. Journeymen, skilled but not yet established, wandered from town to town, working for wages and gaining experience. At the bottom remained the apprentices, labouring for room and board and the promise of future advancement. These distinctions created tensions within workshops that had once been more egalitarian. A master smith's prosperity now depended not just on his own skill, but on his ability to manage and profit from the labour of others. The relationship between Edmund and Thomas, once characterised by mutual dependence and shared hardship, might in a guild setting become more explicitly hierarchical, with contractual obligations replacing personal bonds. The evolution of metallurgy itself brought profound changes to the blacksmith's world. The gradual improvement of furnace design allowed for higher temperatures and better control over the smelting process. New techniques for refining iron produced metal of more consistent quality. The introduction of water-powered trip hammers in some regions began to mechanize aspects of the work that had once required purely human strength. These innovations were double-edged gifts. Better iron meant stronger, more durable products, which pleased customers, but also meant that tools and weapons lasted longer, reducing the frequency of replacement and repair work. Mechanical hammers could shape large pieces more efficiently than human hands, but they required significant investment and were practical only in locations with suitable water sources. For smiths working in smaller villages or remote areas, such technological advances remained largely theoretical. Edmund's forge operated much as his grandfather's had, relying on human muscle, practiced eye, and accumulated wisdom passed down through generations. The gap between urban and rural smithing grew wider as the medieval period progressed, creating different classes of craftsmen with varying access to new tools and techniques. The specialization of metalworking also accelerated during this time. While village smiths like Edmund remained generalists by necessity, urban centers saw the emergence of specialized craftsmen focusing on particular products. Armorers devoted themselves exclusively to creating and maintaining military equipment. Cutlers perfected the art of blade making. Locksmiths developed increasingly sophisticated mechanisms for securing doors and strongboxes. This specialization brought both opportunities and threats to the traditional blacksmith. Those who could adapt and develop expertise in particular areas might find lucrative niches serving wealthy patrons or institutional clients. But smiths who remained generalists faced increasing competition from specialists who could produce superior products in their particular domains. The economic pressures on medieval blacksmiths were relentless and multifaceted. The cost of raw materials fluctuated dramatically based on factors entirely beyond their control. Political conflicts could disrupt trade routes, making iron scarce and expensive. Good harvests might increase demand for agricultural tools, while poor ones could leave farmers unable to pay for repairs. Edmund's ledger, had he kept one, would have revealed the precarious nature of his enterprise. A single large commission, such as shoeing horses for a traveling merchant caravan or producing weapons for a local lord's retinue, could provide weeks of steady income. But such opportunities were irregular and unpredictable. More often, the forge's survival depended on a steady stream of small jobs, mending broken hinges, sharpening worn blades, crafting simple household items. The blacksmith's relationship with credit and debt was particularly complex. Customers often lacked ready cash, especially during difficult times, leading to elaborate arrangements involving barter, delayed payment, and reciprocal services. Edmund might shoe a farmer's horse in exchange for grain, or repair a merchant's wagon wheel against the promise of future iron deliveries. These arrangements required careful judgment and constant attention. A smith who was too generous with credit might find himself working for promises that would never be fulfilled. One who was too strict might drive customers to competitors or simply go without the smith's services. The successful blacksmith needed not just technical skill, but also the ability to read character, assess risks, and manage complex webs of obligation. The seasonal nature of much blacksmithing work added another layer of uncertainty. Spring brought farmers seeking tools for planting and ploughing. Summer demanded implements for harvesting. Autumn required equipment for processing crops and preparing for winter. But winter itself was often a lean time when travel was difficult and agricultural work minimal. Smart smiths used the busy seasons to prepare for the lean ones, stockpiling finished goods and raw materials when possible. But this required capital that many smiths simply didn't possess. The feast or famine cycle meant that even successful smiths lived with constant financial anxiety, never knowing when the next dry spell might threaten their survival. The physical toll of the trade continued to mount as smiths aged. The constant heat, smoke, and physical exertion took their cumulative toll on bodies that lacked access to adequate nutrition or medical care. Respiratory problems were endemic among smiths, who spent their working lives breathing the fumes of burning coal and hot metal. Joint problems plagued those who swung hammers for decades. Edmund's hands, once smooth and unmarked, now bore the permanent signatures of his trade. Burns from flying sparks had left their pale scars across his forearms. Years of gripping hammer handles had calloused his palms and slightly deformed his fingers. His back, bent over the forge for countless hours, had developed a permanent stoop that marked him as clearly as any guild badge. Yet for all the hardships, there remained aspects of the blacksmith's life that provided genuine satisfaction. The transformation of raw iron into useful objects retained its almost magical quality. The respect of customers who brought their most essential tools for repair or replacement affirmed the smith's importance to the community. The gradual accumulation of skill and knowledge offered a form of wealth that could not be stolen or taxed away. Thomas, now in his second year of apprenticeship, began to understand these compensations alongside the hardships. His hands, though blistered and burned, were growing stronger and more precise. His eye was learning to judge the color of hot iron, to read the subtle signs that indicated when metal was ready for shaping. Most importantly, he was beginning to feel the deep satisfaction that came from creating something useful with his own hands. The relationship between master and apprentice evolved as Thomas's skills developed. Edmund's initial wariness gave way to a grudging respect for the boy's determination and growing competence. The harsh corrections and constant criticism of the early months were gradually replaced by more nuanced instruction and occasional words of praise. This transformation reflected a fundamental truth about the blacksmith's craft. It could not be learned from books or lectures, but only through patient practice under expert guidance. The subtle techniques that separated masterwork from mere competence were passed down through demonstration and repetition, embedding themselves in muscle memory and intuitive understanding. The social position of blacksmiths varied considerably across different regions and time periods of the medieval era. In some areas, particularly those with strong guild traditions, smiths achieved considerable social mobility and even political influence. Master smiths in major cities might own substantial properties, employ numerous workers, and participate in municipal governance. But in smaller communities, the blacksmith status remained more ambiguous. While essential and generally respected, they were still craftsmen working with their hands, placing them below the landed gentry and wealthy merchants in the social hierarchy. A village smith like Edmund might be prosperous by local standards while remaining effectively powerless in broader political and economic affairs. This social positioning influenced every aspect of the blacksmith's life, from marriage prospects to legal standing. A successful smith might aspire to marry his daughter to a merchant or minor official, using his craft's prosperity to purchase entry into higher social circles. But such advancement was never guaranteed and always remained precarious. The religious dimensions of blacksmithing also shaped the craftsman's world in complex ways. The church's teachings about work and vocation provided a framework for understanding the smith's role in God's plan. Honest labor was virtuous, and the transformation of raw materials into useful objects could be seen as participation in divine creation. Yet the blacksmith's association with fire and metalworking also connected him to older pagan traditions that made some church authorities nervous. The folklore surrounding smiths was rich with supernatural elements, from the ability to break curses to the power to forge magical objects. While officially discouraged, these beliefs persisted in popular culture, adding another layer of complexity to the smith's social position. Religious festivals and holy days provided both opportunities and challenges for medieval blacksmiths. Church prohibitions against working on Sundays and major feast days meant lost income. But these occasions also brought communities together in ways that could generate new business relationships. A smith who was seen as pious and community-minded might find himself favored with commissions from church officials or religiously motivated patrons. The craft's connection to warfare ensured that blacksmiths remained essential even as medieval society evolved. The constant conflicts that characterized much of the medieval period created steady demand for weapons and armor. While village smiths like Edmund might rarely craft sophisticated military equipment, they were constantly called upon to maintain and repair the tools of war. Even in peacetime, the threat of conflict meant that communities needed smiths capable of quickly converting agricultural implements into makeshift weapons. A plowshare could become a spear point, a pruning hook could be reshaped into a blade. This dual-use nature of many metal objects meant that blacksmiths occupied a strategic position in their community's defense capabilities. The knowledge required for weapon making was carefully guarded and selectively shared. While any competent smith could forge a basic blade, the techniques for creating truly effective weapons were closely held secrets. The ability to properly heat-treat steel, to achieve the right balance between hardness and flexibility, to create edges that would hold their sharpness in battle. These skills mark the difference between a village craftsman and a master weaponsmith. As medieval society gradually evolved toward the early modern period, the blacksmith's world began to change in fundamental ways. The rise of blast furnaces and more sophisticated metallurgy started to centralize iron production in ways that would eventually challenge the village smith's role. The increasing use of firearms began to change the nature of warfare and the types of metalwork in demand. But these changes came slowly, and for most of the medieval period, the blacksmith remained a central figure in community life. Edmund's forge, with its glowing coals and ringing anvil, represented far more than just a place of business. It was a symbol of human ingenuity, of the ability to transform raw materials into the tools that made civilization possible. The smoke rising from the forge chimney told the village that all was well. that the essential work of maintaining and creating the metal objects upon which daily life depended continued. The rhythmic hammering that echoed through the streets provided a reassuring soundtrack to community life, a reminder that skilled hands were at work solving the practical problems that faced every household and farm. In the end, the story of the medieval blacksmith is the story of human adaptation and perseverance. Faced with technological limitations, economic uncertainty, and social constraints that would seem overwhelming to modern observers, craftsmen like Edmund and apprentices like Thomas found ways not just to survive but to contribute meaningfully to their communities. Their legacy extends far beyond the specific objects they created. In their workshops, crucial technologies were preserved and gradually improved. Through their training of apprentices, essential skills were passed down across generations. In their daily interactions with customers and neighbors, they helped to maintain the social bonds that held medieval communities together. The medieval blacksmith's world was harsh, demanding, and often brutal. But it was also a world where skill mattered, where honest work was valued, and where the transformation of raw materials into useful objects retained its fundamental importance to human society. As the forge fire burned low at the end of another long day, and Thomas swept the iron filings from around the anvil, both master and apprentice could take satisfaction in work well done, in metal properly shaped, in tools that would serve their users faithfully in the days to come. The great wheel of seasons would continue to turn, bringing new challenges and opportunities to the forge. But the essential rhythms of the blacksmith's life would remain constant. The daily lighting of the fire, the careful selection of iron, the patient shaping of metal into useful forms, and the quiet pride that came from mastering one of humanity's most ancient and essential crafts. Based on the reference materials provided, here is part 3 of the 12-part script for Life as a Medieval Blacksmith Was Brutal, Boring History for Sleep. The persistent ringing of hammer on anvil echoed through the smoky workshop as dawn broke over the medieval village. For the blacksmith, this was not merely the start of another workday, but the continuation of an endless cycle of fire, metal, and sweat that would consume his every waking moment. The forge, already glowing with the embers kept alive through the night, demanded immediate attention. Coal had to be added carefully, the bellows pumped rhythmically, and the fire coaxed to the precise temperature needed for the day's work ahead. The medieval blacksmith's workshop was a study in organized chaos. Tools hung from every available surface, their forms dictated by centuries of refinement and necessity. Hammers of various weights and sizes lined the walls, each designed for specific tasks. The lighter crosspeen hammers for delicate work, the massive sledgehammers for heavy forging, and the specialized ball-peen hammers for riveting and shaping. Tongs in dozens of configurations gripped hot metal in ways that human hands never could, their jaws shaped to hold everything from thin wire to massive iron bars. The anvil itself was the heart of the operation, a massive block of iron that might weigh several hundred pounds. Its surface, polished smooth by countless hammer blows, bore the scars of generations of work. The horn extending from one end allowed for the forming of curves and circles, while the hardy hole provided a socket for specialized tools. Every surface of the anvil had its purpose, and a skilled blacksmith could produce dozens of different shapes using this single piece of equipment. But the true skill of the medieval blacksmith lay not in his tools, but in his ability to read the metal itself. Iron and steel behaved differently at different temperatures, and these differences were visible only to the trained eye. The blacksmith learned to recognize the subtle color changes that indicated when metal was ready for different types of work. A dull red heat for bending, a bright orange for drawing out, a yellow heat for welding, and the dangerous white heat that could burn the metal if not carefully controlled. This knowledge was not learned from books or formal instruction, but through years of apprenticeship that began in childhood. A blacksmith's son might start by working the bellows, a job that required constant attention and considerable strength. The rhythm of the bellows was crucial, providing just enough air to maintain the fire without creating the violent heat that could ruin delicate work. As the boy grew stronger and more observant, he would graduate to holding pieces for the master smith, learning to anticipate the next tool needed, the next adjustment required. The progression from apprentice to journeyman to master was measured not in years, but in the accumulation of skills and the development of an almost supernatural sense for the behavior of hot metal. A master blacksmith could judge the temperature of iron by its color in complete darkness, could feel through his hammer the exact moment when a piece was ready for the next stage of work, could hear in the ring of the anvil whether the metal was properly heated or beginning to cool beyond usefulness. The variety of work demanded of a medieval blacksmith was staggering. In a single day, he might be called upon to shoe a horse, repair a plough, forge nails, mend a cooking pot, sharpen tools, and create specialized items for the local church or manor house. Each task required its own techniques, its own understanding of how metal would behave under specific conditions. The blacksmith was simultaneously a craftsman, an engineer, and an artist, creating both the purely functional and the decoratively beautiful. Horseshoeing alone was a complex art that required understanding not just of metalwork, but of anatomy and animal behavior. Each horse's hoof was unique, requiring shoes that were individually forged and fitted. The blacksmith had to work quickly, as keeping a horse standing on 3 legs for extended periods was both uncomfortable for the animal and dangerous for the smith. The shoes had to be shaped precisely, heated to just the right temperature for fitting, and attached with nails that held securely without damaging the hoof. Agricultural tools represented another major category of the blacksmith's work. Plowshares wore down quickly in the rocky medieval soil and required constant sharpening and replacement. Scythes and sickles needed to be forged with exactly the right curve and temper to cut cleanly through grain. Axes and other cutting tools required careful attention to the balance between hardness, which maintained a sharp edge, and toughness, which prevented the blade from shattering under impact. The creation of nails, seemingly simple items, actually demonstrated the blacksmith's skill in remarkable ways. Each nail was individually forged from iron rod, requiring the smith to heat, draw out, and head the metal in a series of precise operations. A skilled blacksmith could produce hundreds of nails in a day, each one formed with mechanical precision despite being entirely handmade. The consistency of these nails was crucial, as they were used in everything from building construction to ship assembly, where uniformity was essential for structural integrity. Weapons and armor represented the pinnacle of the blacksmith's art, requiring not only technical skill, but an understanding of metallurgy that bordered on the scientific. A sword blade had to be hard enough to hold a sharp edge, but flexible enough not to shatter on impact. This was achieved through careful control of carbon content and sophisticated heat treatment processes that varied the characteristics of different parts of the blade. The spine of a sword might be left relatively soft for flexibility, while the edge was hardened to maintain sharpness. The forging of a sword began with the selection of appropriate iron and steel. Medieval blacksmiths had learned to recognize different grades of metal by their spark patterns when ground, their behavior in the forge, and their response to various treatments. The best swords were often made from pattern-welded steel, where strips of iron and steel were twisted together and forged into a single blade, creating both strength and the distinctive wavy patterns that were prized by warriors and collectors alike. Chainmail, that iconic armor of the medieval period, represented thousands of hours of painstaking work. Each ring was individually forged, shaped, and linked to its neighbors in a process that required absolute consistency. A single weak link could mean the difference between life and death for the wearer, so the blacksmith, who specialized in mail, had to maintain perfect quality across thousands of individual components. The social position of the blacksmith was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, his skills were absolutely essential to medieval society. Without blacksmiths, agriculture would have been impossible. Warfare could not have been conducted, and the basic tools of daily life could not have been maintained. This importance gave blacksmiths a certain status and economic security that many other craftsmen lacked. A competent blacksmith was always in demand and could command good wages for his work. Yet the blacksmith was also viewed with suspicion and sometimes fear. His work involved the transformation of base metal through fire, a process that seemed almost magical to those who did not understand it. The forge itself, with its roaring flames and shower of sparks, appeared to many as a kind of controlled hellfire. The blacksmith, covered in soot and sweat, wielding massive hammers and tongs, seemed more like a demon than a man to superstitious observers. This ambiguous status was reflected in folklore and literature, where blacksmiths appeared as both helpful craftsmen and mysterious figures with supernatural powers. The god Vulcan, the legendary Wayland the Smith, and countless other mythological figures associated smithing with divine or magical abilities. Real blacksmiths sometimes encouraged these beliefs, as the awe they inspired could be useful in negotiations and business dealings. The guild system that developed in medieval towns provided blacksmiths with both protection and regulation. Blacksmith guilds controlled who could practice the trade, set standards for quality and pricing, and provided support for members and their families. Guild membership was a mark of respectability and competence, but it also came with obligations and restrictions. A guild blacksmith had to maintain certain standards, contribute to guild activities, and often could not work outside his designated area without permission. The training system within the guilds was rigorous and hierarchical. An apprentice blacksmith would spend 7 years or more learning the basics of the trade, during which time he received little or no pay and was completely dependent on his master for food, shelter, and instruction. The master had absolute authority over the apprentice and could extend the period of training if he felt the young man had not yet mastered the necessary skills. Upon completion of his apprenticeship, a blacksmith became a journeyman, free to work for wages, but not yet qualified to establish his own shop or take on apprentices. To achieve master status, a journeyman had to demonstrate his skills by creating a masterpiece, a complex piece of work that showed his competence in all aspects of the trade. This masterpiece was judged by the guild masters, and only those whose work met the strict standards were admitted to full membership. The daily routine of a medieval blacksmith was dictated by the demands of the fire and the availability of light. Work began before dawn with the lighting of the forge, a process that required careful attention to ensure the fire would burn cleanly and evenly throughout the day. The first tasks were often the completion of work left over from the previous day, items that had been shaped but needed final details or finishing. As the day progressed, the blacksmith would tackle the heavier work that required the most heat and energy. This was when major forging operations were performed, when large pieces were shaped and welded, when the most demanding physical labor was done. The afternoon might be devoted to finishing work, the delicate operations that required good light and steady hands. The workshop was a dangerous place, filled with fire, hot metal, and heavy tools. Burns were an occupational hazard that every blacksmith learned to live with. The constant exposure to heat and sparks left most smiths with scarred hands and arms, and serious burns were always a possibility. Flying sparks could cause eye injuries, and the inhalation of smoke and metal particles took a toll on the lungs over time. The physical demands of the work were enormous. Swinging heavy hammers for hours at a time built tremendous upper body strength, but also led to joint problems and muscle strain. The heat of the forge was exhausting, particularly in summer, and dehydration was a constant concern. Many blacksmiths developed chronic back problems from bending over the anvil, and hearing loss from the constant ringing of hammer on metal was common. Despite these hardships, there was also a deep satisfaction in the work. The blacksmith could see the immediate results of his labor in the finished products that emerged from his forge. Unlike many other medieval occupations, where the fruits of labor might not be visible for months or years, the blacksmith's work produced tangible, useful objects on a daily basis. There was pride in creating something from raw materials, in solving the technical problems that each new project presented, in seeing one's creations put to use in the community. The relationship between the blacksmith and his customers was often close and personal. In a small medieval community, the blacksmith knew everyone and understood their specific needs. He might forge a special tool for a particular craftsman, repair a treasured family heirloom, or create decorative ironwork for the local church. These personal relationships gave meaning to the work beyond mere economic exchange. The blacksmith's workshop was often a gathering place for the community, particularly during the long winter evenings, when little outdoor work could be done. The warmth of the forge attracted neighbors who came to socialize, share news, and discuss the events of the day. The blacksmith, with his central role in the community's economic life, was often privy to information about local politics, trade, and social developments. As medieval society evolved, so too did the role of the blacksmith. The growth of towns and cities created new opportunities and challenges. Urban blacksmiths could specialize in particular types of work, developing expertise in areas like lockmaking, weapon forging, or decorative ironwork. This specialization allowed for higher quality products, but also increased competition and the need for innovation. The development of water-powered machinery began to change the nature of blacksmith work as well. Water wheels could power massive bellows that maintained more consistent forge temperatures, and trip hammers could deliver blows with force and precision that no human smith could match. These innovations increased productivity, but also required significant capital investment and access to water power, advantages that favored larger operations over individual craftsmen. Trade relationships expanded the blacksmith's world beyond the local community. Iron ore from distant mines, specialized tools from other regions, and new techniques learned from traveling craftsmen all contributed to the evolution of the trade. The exchange of knowledge and materials connected individual blacksmiths to a broader network of craftsmen and merchants that spanned much of medieval Europe. The religious aspects of medieval life also touched the blacksmith's work. Churches required ironwork for doors, hinges, locks, and decorative elements. The creation of religious objects, from simple crosses to elaborate reliquaries, represented some of the most challenging and rewarding work a blacksmith could undertake. These projects often pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible and resulted in innovations that influenced secular work as well. The economic importance of the blacksmith cannot be overstated. In a society where virtually everything was made by hand, the blacksmith's role in creating and maintaining tools was fundamental to all other economic activity. Farmers depended on blacksmiths for their plows and harvesting tools, carpenters for their chisels and saws, soldiers for their weapons and armor. The productivity of the entire society was, in many ways, limited by the capacity and skill of its blacksmiths. As we consider the life of the medieval blacksmith, we see a figure who embodied both the harsh realities and the remarkable achievements of his era. His days were filled with backbreaking labor, constant danger, and the ever-present heat and smoke of the forge. Yet through his skill and dedication, he created the tools and weapons that shaped medieval civilization. His work connected the raw materials of the earth to the needs of human society, transforming iron ore into the countless objects that made life possible in an age when technology was limited, but craftsmanship was supreme. The legacy of the medieval blacksmith extends far beyond the Middle Ages. The techniques they developed, the tools they created, and the traditions they established formed the foundation for the Industrial Revolution that would follow. Their understanding of metallurgy, their methods of heat treatment, and their approaches to problem-solving would influence manufacturing for centuries to come. In the persistence and ingenuity of the medieval blacksmith, we see reflected the enduring human capacity to shape the world through skill, determination, and the willingness to endure hardship in pursuit of craft mastery. Part 4. Technological advances and social stratification. As we've explored the brutal apprenticeships and dangerous workshops that shaped young smiths like Thomas, we now turn to examine how technological innovation gradually transformed the blacksmithing trade while simultaneously deepening the social divisions that characterized medieval society. The evolution of metallurgical techniques during this period would prove both liberating and constraining for those who wielded hammer and anvil. The centuries following the Norman conquest witnessed remarkable advances in iron and steel production that would fundamentally alter the blacksmith's craft. The introduction of water-powered trip hammers around the 12th century represented perhaps the most significant technological leap since the invention of the blast furnace. These massive mechanical hammers, driven by the relentless turning of water wheels, could deliver blows of unprecedented force and consistency, allowing smiths to work larger pieces of iron and achieve more uniform results than ever before. Master Edmund of Ashford, whose workshop sat beside the rushing waters of the River Medway, was among the first in his region to harness this new technology. The installation of a trip hammer in his forge around 1180 transformed not only his output, but his entire approach to the craft. Where once he and his apprentices had laboured for hours to draw out a single piece of iron into workable form, the mechanical hammer could accomplish the same task in minutes. The rhythmic thundering of the great hammer became the heartbeat of his expanded operation, its percussion echoing across the valley like the footsteps of some iron giant. Yet this technological marvel came at considerable cost. The construction of water-powered machinery required substantial capital investment, forcing many smiths into arrangements with wealthy merchants or noble patrons who could finance such improvements. Edmund found himself increasingly dependent upon Sir Geoffrey de Clare, the local lord who had provided the funds for his hammer in exchange for a substantial portion of his profits. What had begun as a partnership gradually evolved into something approaching vassalage, as Edmund discovered that his technological advantage came with strings attached. The advent of improved furnace designs during the 13th century further accelerated these changes. The development of blast furnaces capable of reaching temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees Celsius enabled the consistent production of cast iron, a material that could be melted and poured into molds rather than laboriously forged by hand. These towering structures, some reaching heights of 30 feet or more, required teams of workers to operate and vast quantities of charcoal to fuel their insatiable hunger for heat. The impact of these innovations rippled through every aspect of blacksmithing society. In the countryside, traditional smiths who lacked access to the latest technology found themselves increasingly marginalized. Their hand-forged products, while often superior in quality to machine-hammered work, could not compete with the speed and consistency of water-powered production. Many rural smiths were forced to specialize in repair work and agricultural tools, leaving the lucrative trade in weapons and luxury items to their better-equipped urban counterparts. Thomas, now a journeyman in his third decade, witnessed these changes with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. The techniques his master had taught him, the careful reading of sparks, the subtle gradations of heat color, the intimate knowledge of how iron behaved under the hammer, seemed increasingly obsolete in an age of mechanical precision. Yet he also recognized that the new technology, for all its power, lacked the human touch that distinguished truly exceptional work from mere competent production. The rise of specialized production centers fundamentally altered the geography of the trade. Certain regions became renowned for particular types of metalwork: the swordsmiths of Toledo, the armorers of Milan, the toolmakers of Nuremberg. These centers attracted the most skilled craftsmen and the most advanced technology, creating concentrations of expertise that smaller workshops could not hope to match. The result was an increasingly stratified profession with a small elite of master craftsmen at the top, a broader middle tier of competent specialists, and a large base of ordinary smiths relegated to routine work. Guild systems evolved to manage these new realities, establishing elaborate hierarchies that reflected both technical competence and economic power. The London Blacksmiths Guild, chartered in 1299, developed a complex system of ranks and privileges that governed everything from the quality of materials a smith could purchase to the types of work he was permitted to undertake. Master smiths who could afford the latest technology found themselves elevated to positions of considerable influence within these organizations, while those who clung to traditional methods were gradually excluded from the most profitable opportunities. The social implications of these technological changes extended far beyond the workshops themselves. As blacksmiths became more prosperous and influential, they began to challenge traditional social hierarchies. Wealthy master smiths purchased land, built substantial houses, and sought to marry their children into merchant families or even minor nobility. This social mobility, while limited, represented a significant departure from the rigid caste system that had previously defined medieval society. Yet, for every smith who rose in status, many more found their positions diminished. The concentration of advanced technology in fewer hands meant that employment opportunities for ordinary smiths became increasingly scarce. Journeymen who once could expect to establish their own workshops after completing their training now faced the prospect of permanent employment as wage laborers in larger operations. The independence that had traditionally characterized the blacksmithing trade, the sense that a skilled craftsman could always make his way in the world with nothing more than his tools and knowledge, began to erode as the profession became more capital intensive. The psychological impact of these changes was profound. Smiths had long prided themselves on being masters of their craft, beholden to none but their own skill and industry. The new technological order introduced relationships of dependence that many found deeply unsettling. Master Edmund, for all his success with the trip hammer, often reflected bitterly on how his innovations had made him subordinate to Sir Geoffrey's financial interests. The roar of his water-powered hammer, once a source of pride, sometimes seemed to him like the sound of his own independence being pounded into submission. These tensions manifested in various forms of resistance and adaptation. Some smiths deliberately rejected new technologies, positioning themselves as guardians of traditional craftsmanship. They cultivated reputations for producing work of exceptional quality, trading on the growing perception that hand-forged items possess superior strength and beauty. Others embraced innovation while seeking to maintain their independence, forming cooperatives that allowed them to share the costs of new equipment while retaining collective ownership. The religious dimensions of these changes cannot be overlooked. The medieval church had long regarded manual labor as a form of prayer, and blacksmiths often saw their work in explicitly spiritual terms. The introduction of mechanical power raised troubling questions about the role of human agency in creation. If a machine could perform the work that had previously required human skill and strength, what did this mean for the spiritual significance of the craft? Some smiths viewed the new technology as a gift from God, enabling them to create more and better work for the glory of the divine. Others saw it as a dangerous departure from the natural order, a prideful attempt to usurp powers that properly belonged to the Creator alone. These theological concerns were not merely abstract speculation, but had practical consequences for how smiths approached their work. The design and decoration of items became increasingly important as smiths sought to demonstrate that human creativity and spiritual insight could not be replicated by machines. Elaborate patterns, religious imagery, and symbolic elements became more common as craftsmen emphasized the aspects of their work that remained uniquely human. The environmental impact of technological advancement also shaped the development of the trade. The voracious appetite of blast furnaces for charcoal led to widespread deforestation in many regions, forcing smiths to seek alternative fuel sources or relocate their operations. The pollution generated by large-scale iron production began to affect the health of workers and nearby communities, leading to conflicts over the placement of industrial facilities. These environmental pressures contributed to the concentration of heavy industry in specific locations, further accelerating the geographical stratification of the trade. Women's roles within blacksmithing communities underwent significant changes during this period of technological transition. While the physical demands of operating trip hammers and blast furnaces generally excluded women from direct participation in heavy metalwork, they found new opportunities in the expanding commercial aspects of the trade. Smiths' wives and daughters often managed the business side of operations, handling customer relations, maintaining accounts, and coordinating the complex supply chains that fed the new industrial processes. Some women established themselves as specialized traders, dealing in the exotic materials, rare ores, imported alloys, specialized tools that the new technology required. The training of apprentices also evolved in response to technological change. Where once a young man could expect to learn his trade primarily through observation and imitation, the operation of complex machinery required more systematic instruction. Written manuals began to appear, documenting techniques and procedures that had previously been transmitted entirely through oral tradition. This shift toward formal education created new barriers to entry for poor families who could not afford the extended training periods that mastery of the new technology required. The international dimensions of technological transfer played an increasingly important role in shaping local blacksmithing traditions. Techniques developed in one region spread rapidly along trade routes, carried by traveling craftsmen, merchants, and military campaigns. The Crusades, for all their religious motivation, served as a crucial conduit for the exchange of metallurgical knowledge between European and Middle Eastern smiths. Spanish smiths learned Damascus steel techniques from their Muslim neighbors, while Islamic craftsmen adopted European innovations in armor design and production. This cross-cultural exchange was not always peaceful or voluntary. The conquest of Constantinople by Western Crusaders in 1204 led to the systematic looting of Byzantine workshops and the forced migration of skilled craftsmen to Western Europe. Similarly, the Christian reconquest of Spain resulted in the displacement of many Muslim smiths, though some remained to teach their techniques to Christian successors. These violent disruptions of established craft traditions had lasting impacts on the development of metallurgical technology throughout Europe. As we delve deeper into the social stratification that technological change created within blacksmithing communities, we must consider how these developments affected the daily lives and aspirations of ordinary craftsmen. Thomas, now approaching middle age, found himself caught between two worlds: the traditional craft culture of his youth and the increasingly mechanized reality of contemporary production. His skills, honed through decades of practice, remained valuable but were no longer sufficient to guarantee prosperity or independence. The emergence of what we might recognize as early industrial capitalism fundamentally altered the relationship between skill and reward in the blacksmithing trade. Master smiths who could afford to invest in new technology found their profits multiplying, while those who lacked capital saw their earnings stagnate or decline. This growing inequality created tensions within guild structures that had previously emphasized brotherhood and mutual support among craftsmen of different skill levels. The standardization that mechanical production enabled also had profound cultural implications. Regional variations in technique and style, which had previously distinguished the work of different smithing traditions, began to disappear as producers sought to meet uniform specifications. The distinctive character of local craftsmanship gave way to more homogeneous products that could be manufactured efficiently and sold in distant markets. While this standardization brought economic benefits, it also represented a form of cultural loss that many contemporary observers mourned. The increasing scale of production operations required new forms of organization and management that challenged traditional craft relationships. Master smiths found themselves functioning more as entrepreneurs than as craftsmen, spending their time managing workers and coordinating production rather than working directly with iron and steel. This separation of conception from execution fundamentally altered the nature of craft knowledge, creating a distinction between those who designed and planned work and those who carried it out. The implications of these changes extended far beyond the boundaries of individual workshops or even the blacksmithing trade itself. The technological and organizational innovations pioneered in medieval metalworking would provide crucial foundations for the industrial developments of later centuries. The concentration of production, the specialization of labor, the application of mechanical power, all of these elements that emerged in medieval smithies would eventually transform manufacturing across all sectors of the economy. Yet even as these broader historical forces shaped the trajectory of technological development, individual smiths continued to find ways to adapt and thrive within the changing landscape of their trade. Some embraced new roles as technical innovators, devoting their energies to improving existing machinery or developing new production techniques. Others carved out niches as specialists in particular types of work that remained resistant to mechanization. Still others found success as teachers and consultants, selling their expertise to smiths in other regions who sought to modernize their operations. The resilience and adaptability that smiths demonstrated in the face of technological disruption reflected deeper cultural values that had long characterized their profession. The willingness to work with dangerous materials under extreme conditions, the patience required to master complex skills, the pride taken in creating objects of lasting utility and beauty. These qualities served smiths well as they navigated the challenges of a rapidly changing craft environment. As evening falls over the medieval landscape and the last hammer blows of the day fade into silence, we can reflect on how the technological advances of this period fundamentally reshaped not only the practice of blacksmithing, but the social relationships that surrounded it. The introduction of water-powered machinery and improved furnace designs created new possibilities for production, while simultaneously generating new forms of inequality and dependence. The craft that had once offered a path to independence and social mobility for skilled workers became increasingly stratified, with technological access determining economic success as much as traditional craftsmanship. These changes would continue to reverberate through the centuries that followed, establishing patterns of technological adoption and social adaptation that would shape the development of industrial society. The medieval blacksmith's workshop, with its combination of ancient skills and innovative machinery, its mixture of cooperation and competition, its blend of tradition and transformation, provides a compelling preview of the broader industrial changes that would eventually reshape all aspects of human labor and social organization. The story of medieval blacksmithing thus becomes not merely an account of one particular craft, but a window into the broader processes of technological and social change that defined the medieval period and established the foundations for the modern world. In the sparks that flew from Thomas's anvil and the thunder of Master Edmund's trip hammer, we can hear the first notes of the industrial symphony that would eventually transform human civilization. Part 5 continues the exploration of medieval blacksmith life, focusing on the technological advances and social changes that transformed the trade. Medieval blacksmithing underwent a profound transformation during the 12th and 13th centuries, as technological innovations began to revolutionize the craft. The introduction of water-powered trip hammers marked perhaps the most significant advancement. These massive mechanical hammers, driven by water wheels, could deliver blows far more powerful and consistent than any human arm. The rhythmic thundering of these machines echoed through river valleys, announcing the arrival of a new age in metalworking. Master smiths who could afford such equipment found their productivity increase dramatically. What once required hours of back-breaking labor with hand hammers could now be accomplished in minutes. The water-powered hammers could forge larger pieces, create more uniform results, and allow smiths to work with harder, more resistant metals. However, this technological leap came with its own challenges and consequences. The cost of installing a water-powered hammer was enormous. Only the wealthiest smiths or those backed by nobles could afford such investments. This created a new hierarchy within the blacksmithing community. Traditional village smiths, working with their time-honored hand tools, found themselves increasingly unable to compete with the mechanized workshops. The quality and quantity of work produced by water-powered forges began to set new standards that smaller operations simply could not match. This technological divide led to the emergence of specialized smithing centers. Towns situated along fast-flowing rivers became hubs of metalworking activity. The Black Forest region of Germany, the valleys of northern Italy, and the river systems of England all saw the rise of proto-industrial smithing operations. These centers attracted skilled workers from across Europe, creating concentrations of expertise that further accelerated innovation. The social implications of these changes were profound. Master smiths who successfully adopted the new technology often became wealthy merchants as well as craftsmen. They could accept larger contracts, work with multiple apprentices and journeymen, and accumulate capital that previous generations of smiths could never have imagined. Some established networks of suppliers and customers that stretched across multiple kingdoms, transforming them from local artisans into international businessmen. Yet this progress came at a human cost. Traditional village smiths, who had served their communities for generations, found their skills suddenly obsolete. Many were forced to abandon their ancestral trade or relocate to the emerging industrial centers, leaving behind the tight-knit communities where their families had worked for centuries. The personal relationship between smith and customer, built on trust and local reputation, began to give way to more impersonal commercial transactions. The apprenticeship system also evolved in response to these changes. Young men seeking to learn the trade increasingly gravitated toward the mechanized workshops, where they could learn the latest techniques and potentially gain access to the new technology. This brain drain further weakened traditional smithies and accelerated the concentration of skill and knowledge in the emerging industrial centers. Alongside water-powered hammers, improvements in furnace design revolutionized the smelting and heating processes. The development of blast furnaces, with their towering stone structures and sophisticated bellows systems, allowed smiths to achieve temperatures previously unattainable. These furnaces could burn hotter and more efficiently, enabling the production of higher quality iron and, eventually, cast iron and steel on a larger scale. The introduction of more efficient bellows systems, often powered by the same water wheels that drove the hammers, ensured a consistent supply of air to the furnaces. This eliminated the need for apprentices to manually operate bellows for hours, freeing them for more skilled work while ensuring more consistent forge temperatures. The result was better, more uniform metal that could be worked with greater precision. These technological advances also led to regional specialization within the blacksmithing trade. Certain areas became renowned for specific products based on local resources, technological capabilities, and accumulated expertise. The smiths of Milan became famous throughout Europe for their armor, while the workshops of Toledo gained legendary status for their sword making. The Black Forest region specialized in tools and hardware. while English smiths developed particular expertise in horseshoes and agricultural implements. This specialization created new trade networks and dependencies. A village that had once relied entirely on its local smith for all metal needs might now import specialized items from distant workshops, while still depending on local smiths for basic repairs and everyday items. This created a more complex, interconnected economy, but also made communities more vulnerable to disruptions in trade routes or political upheavals. The rise of mechanized smithing also changed the relationship between smiths and their noble patrons. Lords who controlled water rights and could finance the construction of water-powered workshops gained enormous influence over metal production in their territories. Some established what amounted to state-controlled armaments industries, employing dozens of smiths in massive workshops dedicated to producing weapons and armor for their armies. These developments foreshadowed the Industrial Revolution that would transform Europe centuries later. The concentration of workers, the use of mechanical power, and the emphasis on efficiency and scale all represented departures from traditional craft production. Medieval smiths were pioneers in what would eventually become modern manufacturing. However, the transformation was neither uniform nor immediate. In remote areas or regions without suitable water sources, traditional smithing methods persisted for centuries. Many village smiths continued to serve their local communities, using techniques that had remained largely unchanged since Roman times. This created a dual economy, where cutting-edge technology existed alongside ancient methods, sometimes within a few miles of each other. The psychological impact of these changes on individual smiths was considerable. Master craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting their hand-forging techniques sometimes found their skills valued less than their ability to operate and maintain machinery. The intimate knowledge of metal behavior, temperature, and timing that had been the hallmark of master smiths remained important, but it was now combined with mechanical and engineering knowledge that many found difficult to master. Young apprentices entering the trade during this period of transition faced unique challenges. They needed to learn both traditional techniques, which remained essential for many types of work, and the new mechanical methods that represented the future of the industry. This expanded curriculum made apprenticeships longer and more complex, requiring greater intellectual as well as physical capabilities. The guild system also evolved to accommodate these changes. Guilds that had traditionally focused on maintaining quality and limiting competition now found themselves needing to facilitate technological innovation and capital investment. Some guilds established collective workshops where members could share the costs of expensive equipment. Others developed new categories of membership to accommodate the emerging class of mechanized master smiths. Despite these technological advances, the fundamental challenges of medieval life continued to affect blacksmiths. Political instability, warfare, and economic disruption could still devastate even the most advanced workshops. The investment in fixed infrastructure like water wheels and blast furnaces made smiths more vulnerable to military action, as these facilities were often targets during conflicts. Environmental concerns, largely ignored during this period, would eventually become significant issues. The concentration of smithing operations led to localized pollution problems. Rivers became contaminated with slag and other metalworking waste. Forests were depleted to provide charcoal for the furnaces, and the air in smithing centers became thick with smoke and particulates. These problems would only worsen as the scale of operations continued to increase. The technological revolution in medieval blacksmithing ultimately laid the groundwork for the industrial transformation of Europe. The lessons learned about mechanical power, industrial organization, and capital investment would be applied to other trades and industries. The social changes, the emergence of industrial capitalists, the displacement of traditional craftsmen, and the concentration of production in specialized centers would become defining features of the modern economy. As we consider the lives of medieval blacksmiths during this period of transformation, we see a microcosm of broader historical forces. Innovation brought opportunity and prosperity for some, displacement and hardship for others. The tension between tradition and progress, between individual craft skill and mechanical efficiency, between local community and global markets. These themes would echo through the centuries that followed. The blacksmiths who lived through these changes were witnesses to and participants in one of history's great transformations. Their hammers, whether wielded by hand or powered by rushing water, were forging not just iron and steel, but the foundations of the modern world. Their story reminds us that technological progress, while often beneficial in the long term, can exact a significant human cost in the short term, and that the most profound changes in human society often begin in the workshops and laboratories of skilled craftsmen pushing the boundaries of what is possible. Part 6. The Weight of the Hammer. As the pale light of dawn crept through the narrow windows of the smithy, Thomas rubbed the sleep from his eyes and flexed his aching fingers. The calluses that had formed over years of gripping hammer and tong had grown so thick they resembled leather, yet still his joints protested with each movement. At 42 years of age, he was considered ancient by the standards of his trade. Most blacksmiths were broken men by their fourth decade, their bodies worn down by the relentless demands of fire and metal. The transformation of the blacksmith's craft had accelerated beyond anything Thomas could have imagined when he first took up the hammer as a boy. Where once a village might have supported a single smith working alone at his forge, now great complexes of workshops sprawled across the landscape. The water-powered trip hammers that had seemed like miraculous innovations just a generation ago were now commonplace, their thunderous rhythm echoing across valleys from dawn until dusk. These mechanical marvels could deliver blows with a force no human arm could match, shaping red-hot iron with precision and speed that left traditional smiths struggling to compete. Yet for all their power, the trip hammers demanded their own terrible price. The constant vibration traveled through stone foundations and wooden frames, rattling the teeth of every worker within 100 yards. Men who operated these machines often developed a peculiar tremor in their hands, a condition the guild physicians could neither explain nor cure. The blast furnaces, too, had grown larger and more sophisticated. Where medieval smiths had worked with small hearths that barely reached the temperature needed to soften iron, these new furnaces roared like caged dragons, consuming vast quantities of charcoal and ore to produce rivers of molten metal. The heat they generated was so intense that specialized workers, known as furnace men, developed their own hierarchy within the guild structure. These furnace men were a breed apart, their faces permanently flushed from exposure to extreme temperatures, their hair often singed away entirely. They worked in shifts around the clock, for the furnaces could never be allowed to cool completely without risking catastrophic damage to their carefully constructed interiors. The knowledge required to maintain these temperamental giants was closely guarded, passed down through families like precious heirlooms. Thomas remembered his grandfather speaking of simpler times, when a blacksmith knew every aspect of his craft intimately. The old man had been able to judge the temperature of iron by its color alone, selecting tools and techniques through intuition honed over decades of practice. But the new methods demanded specialization that fragmented the ancient unity of the trade. Now there were drawboys who operated the bellows, their young arms pumping in endless rhythm to maintain the furnace fires. There were strikers who wielded the heavy hammers under the direction of master smiths, their muscled backs gleaming with sweat as they delivered precisely timed blows. There were finishers who smoothed and polished the rough products of the forge, their delicate touch transforming crude iron into objects of beauty and function. The social implications of these changes rippled outward like rings in a pond. Where once blacksmiths had enjoyed a certain independence, working directly with local farmers and craftsmen to meet immediate needs, They now found themselves increasingly dependent on distant markets and the whims of wealthy patrons who could afford the expensive products of the new industrial methods. The guild system, which had once protected the interests of individual craftsmen, began to favor those who could invest in the costly new equipment. Master smiths, who owned water-powered hammers and shares in blast furnaces, accumulated wealth and influence that their predecessors could never have imagined. They built grand houses in the growing towns, their children educated by private tutors rather than learning the trade through traditional apprenticeship. Meanwhile, the journeymen and apprentices found their prospects increasingly limited. The old dream of eventually establishing one's own forge became ever more distant as the capital requirements for competitive smithing operations soared beyond the reach of common workers. Many skilled craftsmen found themselves permanent employees rather than independent artisans, their expertise valued but their autonomy lost. The regional specialization that emerged from these technological advances created new forms of inequality between different areas. Towns that gained access to swift-flowing rivers suitable for powering machinery prospered, while communities dependent on traditional methods found themselves economically marginalized. The famous sword-making centers of Toledo and Milan commanded premium prices for their sophisticated products, while village smiths struggled to compete even in their local markets. This geographic concentration of production also made the craft more vulnerable to disruption. When political conflicts or natural disasters affected major centers, the ripple effects could be felt across entire kingdoms. The interdependence that had once been a source of strength for the blacksmithing community became a potential weakness as supply chains grew longer and more complex. The environmental consequences of the new industrial methods were becoming increasingly apparent as well. The voracious appetite of the blast furnaces for charcoal had begun to strip forests bare across much of Europe. Entire valleys that had once been clothed in ancient woodlands were reduced to stumps and scrubland, their ecosystems forever altered by the demands of iron production. The smoke and fumes from the expanded operations created new forms of pollution that affected not just the workers directly involved, but entire communities. Children living near the great furnaces developed respiratory ailments at alarming rates, their lungs scarred by the constant inhalation of metallic particles and noxious gases. The very air seemed to shimmer with heat and haze, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that visitors found both fascinating and disturbing. Water sources, too, bore the burden of industrial expansion. The slack water used to cool hot iron carried with it dissolved metals and other contaminants that poisoned streams and wells for miles downstream. Fish populations collapsed in rivers that had once teemed with life, and farmers complained that their crops withered when watered from contaminated sources. Yet for all these costs, the technological revolution in blacksmithing was irreversible. The superior products emerging from the new methods created demand that traditional techniques simply could not satisfy. Armor made with trip hammer techniques offered better protection to knights and soldiers. Tools forged in blast furnace iron lasted longer and performed better in the hands of farmers and craftsmen. The economic advantages were undeniable, even as the social and environmental costs mounted. The psychological impact on individual craftsmen was perhaps the most profound change of all. The medieval blacksmith had been a figure of almost mythical status in his community, a master of the ancient mysteries of fire and metal whose skills seemed to border on magic. The rhythmic ringing of his hammer had provided a musical backdrop to village life, a sound as familiar and comforting as church bells or bird song. But the new industrial smiths were increasingly anonymous figures, specialized workers in complex operations that no single individual could fully comprehend. The personal relationship between craftsman and customer, which had been central to the traditional trade, gave way to more distant commercial arrangements mediated by merchants and middlemen. The apprenticeship system, which had served for centuries as a means of preserving and transmitting both technical knowledge and cultural values, began to break down under the pressure of rapid technological change. Young men who might once have spent 7 years learning every aspect of the blacksmith's art now found themselves trained for specific, narrow functions within larger operations. The oral traditions that had bound generations of smiths together, the songs and stories passed down in the quiet moments between hammer blows, began to fade as the constant noise of machinery made conversation difficult. The contemplative aspects of the craft, the meditative rhythm of hand forging that had provided spiritual as well as material satisfaction, were lost in the urgent pace of industrial production. Thomas paused in his work to wipe the sweat from his brow, the familiar gesture bringing back memories of his father and grandfather performing the same motion in this very forge. The continuity that had once seemed eternal now felt fragile, threatened by forces beyond any individual's control. The hammer in his hand, worn smooth by generations of use, might well be among the last of its kind to shape iron through human strength alone. Around him, the sounds of the changing world intruded even into this traditional space. The distant rumble of water wheels, the hiss of steam from cooling metal, the shouts of workers coordinating complex operations, all spoke of a transformation that would reshape not just the craft of blacksmithing, but the very fabric of human society. The young apprentices who still came to learn the old ways did so with one eye toward the future, knowing that their careers would likely take them far from the simple forges of their training. Some spoke of traveling to the great industrial centers, where opportunities for advancement might compensate for the loss of independence. Others dreamed of combining traditional skills with new technologies, hoping to find a middle path between past and future. Yet even as the world changed around them, the fundamental relationship between human will and stubborn metal remained constant. Iron still required patient heating, careful timing, and skilled manipulation to transform from raw ore into useful objects. The mysteries of metallurgy, for all the advances in technique and equipment, still demanded knowledge that could only be gained through years of practice and observation. In this tension between continuity and change, between tradition and innovation, the blacksmiths of the late medieval period found themselves at the center of a transformation that would echo through the centuries. They were both the agents and the victims of technological progress, their ancient craft serving as the foundation for developments that would ultimately transcend anything their predecessors could have imagined. The story of their adaptation, their struggles, and their contributions to the emerging industrial world remains a testament to the resilience of human creativity and the enduring importance of skilled craftsmanship. Even as the individual smith became a smaller figure in an increasingly complex economic landscape, the knowledge and techniques they preserved would prove essential to the continued advancement of human civilization. As Thomas returned to his work, the familiar weight of the hammer in his hand, connecting him to countless generations of craftsmen, he carried forward not just the technical skills of his trade, but the deeper human values that had always defined the blacksmith's calling: the dedication to quality, the respect for materials, the patience required for mastery. These qualities would prove as valuable in the industrial age as they had been in simpler times. The fire in his forge burned as bright as ever, a symbol of the enduring human capacity to transform the raw materials of the earth into objects of beauty and utility. Whatever the future might bring, that flame would continue to burn, tended by new generations of craftsmen who would find their own ways to honor the ancient traditions while embracing the possibilities of an ever-changing world. As blacksmiths across medieval Scotland bent over their anvils, hammering red-hot iron with practiced precision, they stood at the center of a slowly transforming world. The technological revolution we explored earlier, water-powered hammers thundering in the valleys, blast furnaces roaring to life, had begun to reshape not just how metal was worked, but the very fabric of society itself. The late medieval period witnessed an extraordinary acceleration in metallurgical innovation. New alloys emerged from experimental forges, each breakthrough carefully guarded yet inevitably spreading through the tight networks of guild craftsmen. The introduction of better bellows systems, improved crucible designs, and more sophisticated quenching techniques meant that blacksmiths could now produce steel of unprecedented quality and consistency. But these advances came with their own set of challenges. The traditional master-apprentice relationship, which had governed the craft for centuries, began to strain under the pressure of rapid change. Young apprentices, eager to learn the newest techniques, sometimes found themselves working alongside masters who clung to methods passed down through generations. The workshop became a battleground between tradition and innovation, where the clash of ideologies rang as loudly as hammer on anvil. Consider the plight of young Hamish MacLeod, apprentice to the aging master smith Angus MacBride in a village near Stirling. Hamish had heard whispers of new techniques being used in the larger towns, methods that could produce twice as much finished iron in half the time. But Master MacBride, his hands scarred from 40 years at the forge, refused to abandon the ways his own master had taught him. "The old ways are the true ways," he would mutter, watching with disapproval as Hamish experimented with different tempering methods during his free time. This generational divide reflected broader tensions within Scottish society. The feudal system that had long structured medieval life was beginning to crack under the weight of economic change. Blacksmiths, once firmly bound to their local lords and communities, found themselves with new opportunities and freedoms. The growing market economy meant that a skilled smith could now sell his wares to merchants from distant towns, accumulating wealth and influence that would have been unthinkable for a craftsman just a century earlier. The rise of merchant classes and urban centres created new demands for metal goods. No longer were blacksmiths primarily concerned with making horseshoes and agricultural tools for their immediate neighbours. Now they crafted decorative ironwork for wealthy burgesses, precision instruments for navigators and scholars, and weapons for the private armies of ambitious nobles. Each new market brought its own technical challenges and opportunities for specialisation. In the larger Scottish burghs, we begin to see the emergence of specialised metalworking districts. Edinburgh's Grassmarket became famous for its weaponsmiths, while Glasgow developed a reputation for household goods and church fittings. These concentrations of expertise fostered innovation through competition and collaboration. Smiths working in close proximity to one another could observe new techniques, share materials, and push each other to greater heights of craftsmanship. The guild system, too, was evolving in response to these changes. The traditional structure of master, journeyman, and apprentice remained, but the pathways to advancement became more complex and competitive. Masterwork pieces, the elaborate demonstrations of skill required for advancement to master status, became increasingly sophisticated and expensive to produce. This created new barriers to entry that favoured those with family connections or financial backing, while potentially excluding talented craftsmen from poorer backgrounds. Regional specialisations became more pronounced as different areas of Scotland developed particular expertise. The iron-rich regions of the Highlands became known for their raw material production, while the coal-abundant lowlands specialised in more energy-intensive processes. Coastal areas with good transportation links focused on export goods, while inland communities continued to serve primarily local markets. This geographic division of labour created new interdependencies and trade relationships that bound the country together in ways that transcended traditional clan and feudal loyalties. The environmental consequences of this expansion were becoming increasingly apparent. Forests that had stood for centuries disappeared into the hungry maws of charcoal kilns. Rivers ran brown with the runoff from mining operations. The air in metalworking centres became thick with smoke and particulates that left their mark on buildings and lungs alike. Yet these costs were largely ignored in the rush to capitalize on new opportunities and meet growing demand. Women's roles in the blacksmithing trade, while never formally recognized, became more important during this period of expansion. With masters and journeymen increasingly focused on complex technical work and business relationships, the day-to-day operations of many smithies relied heavily on wives and daughters. They managed the books, dealt with customers, oversaw apprentices, and often possessed intimate knowledge of the craft's technical aspects. Some women, particularly widows of master smiths, effectively ran their late husbands' businesses while maintaining the fiction that male relatives or senior journeymen were in charge. The tools of the trade themselves were evolving rapidly. New hammer designs, improved tongs, more precise measuring instruments, all reflected the growing sophistication of the craft. The forge itself became more complex, with multiple fire areas for different types of work and elaborate chimney systems to improve airflow and reduce smoke. These technical improvements required significant capital investment, further separating successful smiths from their struggling competitors. International trade brought new influences and challenges. Scottish smiths encountered exotic metals and alloys from distant lands, each requiring different working techniques. The influx of foreign goods also meant increased competition, as imported metalwork sometimes undercut local production. This forced Scottish craftsmen to focus on quality and specialisation, developing distinctive styles and techniques that could command premium prices in both domestic and export markets. The relationship between blacksmiths and the church was also changing during this period. While religious institutions remained important patrons, commissioning everything from simple nails to elaborate altar decorations. They no longer held the monopoly on literacy and record-keeping that had once made them essential intermediaries in commercial transactions. Successful smiths increasingly dealt directly with secular merchants and nobles, reducing their dependence on ecclesiastical favour. Military demand continued to drive innovation, but the nature of warfare was changing. The rise of firearms meant that traditional armour became less relevant, while the demand for cannon and other artillery created new technical challenges. Scottish smiths found themselves adapting their skills to produce gun barrels, shot, and the specialised tools needed to maintain these new weapons. This military work was often lucrative but dangerous. Faulty cannon barrels had a tendency to explode, taking their makers' reputations with them. The apprenticeship system, despite its strains, continued to serve as the primary means of transmitting technical knowledge. However, the length and nature of apprenticeships began to vary more widely. In rapidly changing specialties, masters sometimes found that their apprentices possessed more current knowledge than they did, leading to complex negotiations about the traditional hierarchy of the workshop. Some progressive masters began to see their apprentices more as junior partners than as mere servants, sharing both risks and rewards more equitably. As we've seen throughout this exploration of medieval blacksmithing, the craft was never static. It evolved continuously in response to technological innovations, economic pressures, social changes, and environmental constraints. The late medieval period represents a particularly dynamic phase in this evolution, as the foundations were laid for the even more dramatic transformations that would come with the Renaissance and early modern period. The blacksmiths of medieval Scotland lived through a time of unprecedented change, their craft serving as both agent and symbol of broader social transformation. They hammered out not just iron and steel, but new forms of economic relationship, social organisation, and technological possibility. Their legacy extends far beyond the objects they created, encompassing the institutional innovations, technical knowledge, and cultural values that would shape Scotland's future development. In the flickering light of forge fires across the Scottish landscape, we can see reflected the broader story of medieval Europe's transition toward modernity. The blacksmith's workshop served as a crucible not just for metal, but for the social and economic forces that would ultimately transform the entire continent. As the hammers fell silent at the end of each long day, they left behind not just finished goods, but incremental contributions to a revolution that would reshape the world. Here's part 8 of your 12-part script about life as a medieval blacksmith. As we've explored the technological revolution transforming medieval blacksmithing, we now turn our attention to perhaps the most crucial element that determined a blacksmith's fate: the intricate web of social relationships that bound medieval society together. For in this rigid hierarchical world, a blacksmith's success depended not merely on his skill with hammer and anvil, but on his ability to navigate the complex networks of feudal obligation, guild politics, and community standing that shaped every aspect of medieval life. The medieval blacksmith occupied a unique position in the social order, straddling the line between craftsman and essential service provider. Unlike the lowly peasant bound to the soil, the blacksmith possessed skills that granted him a measure of independence and respect. Yet unlike the noble warrior or learned cleric, he remained forever marked by the soot and sweat of manual labor. This liminal status created both opportunities and challenges that would define the smithing profession throughout the medieval period. At the heart of the blacksmith's social world lay the guild system, those powerful organizations that controlled virtually every aspect of craft production in medieval towns and cities. The blacksmiths' guilds were among the most influential of these bodies, wielding considerable economic and political power. To understand a blacksmith's life, one must first comprehend the all-encompassing nature of guild membership. These were not merely professional associations, but total institutions that governed everything from apprenticeship terms to marriage arrangements, from product quality to religious observance. The path to guild membership began in childhood. A boy of 10 or 12, often the son of a blacksmith, but sometimes recruited from promising rural families, would be bound as an apprentice through formal contracts that essentially transferred paternal authority from father to master. These indenture agreements, meticulously recorded in guild registers, specified not only the technical training to be provided, but also the moral and spiritual education required to produce not just skilled craftsmen, but upstanding citizens. The apprentice's life was one of complete subordination. He lived in his master's household, ate at his table, and followed his rules absolutely. The master was legally responsible for the boy's conduct and welfare. But this protective relationship came with harsh discipline. Apprentices who showed disrespect, laziness, or dishonesty faced beatings, extended terms of service, or expulsion from the trade entirely. The guild records of medieval London contain numerous cases of apprentices fleeing abusive masters, only to be hunted down and returned to complete their obligations. Yet for those who endured, apprenticeship provided invaluable education. Beyond the technical skills of metalworking, apprentices learned to read and write, mastered basic mathematics for calculating costs and measurements, and absorbed the complex social protocols that governed relationships between craftsmen, customers, and authorities. They witnessed firsthand the delicate negotiations between masters and nobles, the careful management of guild politics, and the constant balancing act between profit and reputation that defined successful craftsmanship. The transition from apprentice to journeyman marked a crucial turning point. After 7 to 10 years of service, the apprentice would present a masterwork to the guild wardens for evaluation. This piece, often a complex tool or decorative item, demonstrated not only technical competence, but also artistic vision and understanding of the trade's highest standards. Success meant freedom to work for wages, travel between workshops, and begin accumulating the capital necessary for eventual masterhood. Journeymen occupied a precarious middle ground in the social hierarchy. No longer bound servants, but not yet independent masters, They formed a restless class of skilled workers who moved frequently between employers. Many journeyman societies developed during this period, proto-unions that provided mutual aid, regulated wages, and occasionally organized strikes against exploitative masters. These organizations operated in legal grey areas, tolerated by authorities when they maintained order but suppressed when they challenged established power structures. The guild system created artificial scarcity in masterships, carefully limiting the number of workshops permitted in each town. This restriction served multiple purposes. It prevented ruinous competition, maintained quality standards, and preserved the economic privileges of existing masters. But it also created intense competition among journeymen for the rare opportunities to establish independent workshops. Many skilled craftsmen remained journeymen their entire lives, never accumulating sufficient capital or gaining the political connections necessary for advancement. Those fortunate enough to achieve master status entered an exclusive fraternity with significant privileges and responsibilities. Masters controlled workshop operations, owned tools and equipment, and held the exclusive right to train apprentices and sell finished goods. They participated in guild governance, helping to set standards, resolve disputes, and represent the trade's interests to municipal authorities. The most successful masters accumulated considerable wealth, owned multiple properties, and wielded influence extending far beyond their workshops. But masterhood also brought burdens. Guild masters faced constant scrutiny of their work quality, pricing practices, and business conduct. They were required to contribute to guild expenses, participate in religious ceremonies, and provide mutual aid to struggling colleagues. The guild hall became a second home where masters gathered regularly to conduct business, socialize, and maintain the networks that sustained their prosperity. The relationship between blacksmiths and their noble patrons represented another crucial dimension of medieval social dynamics. Great lords required enormous quantities of metalwork for their military campaigns, castle construction, and household operations. A single knight's equipment might include sword, dagger, lancehead, mailshirt, helmet, and various pieces of plate armor, representing months of skilled labor. Castle construction demanded hinges, locks, gates, and countless other iron fittings. Agricultural estates needed plowshares, horseshoes, tools, and hardware. These massive orders created opportunities for blacksmiths to accumulate wealth and status, but they also created dangerous dependencies. A lord who defaulted on payment could bankrupt a workshop overnight. Political upheavals might suddenly eliminate a smith's primary market. The most successful smiths diversified their clientele, balancing noble commissions with work for merchants, clergy, and fellow craftsmen. They also developed networks of subcontractors, smaller workshops that could handle overflow work or specialized tasks. The relationship between blacksmiths and the church added another layer of complexity to medieval social dynamics. Religious institutions were major consumers of metalwork, requiring everything from simple door hinges to elaborate ceremonial objects. Monasteries often maintained their own workshops, but they also commissioned work from urban craftsmen. The church's attitude toward manual labor was ambivalent. While clerical writers often praised the dignity of honest work, they also emphasized the spiritual superiority of contemplative life over material production. Some blacksmiths found opportunities for advancement through church patronage. Skilled artisans might be invited to work on cathedral construction projects, prestigious commissions that could establish reputations and attract noble attention. The most talented smiths created elaborate religious artifacts, altar crosses, reliquaries, and decorative ironwork that demonstrated both technical mastery and spiritual devotion. These pieces often survived in church treasuries for centuries, providing lasting monuments to their creators' skills. The urban environment transformed blacksmithing from a rural craft serving local needs into a specialized industry serving regional and international markets. City smiths developed expertise in particular products. Some workshops focused on weapons, others on tools, still others on decorative items. This specialization increased efficiency and quality, but also created new vulnerabilities. A smith specializing in agricultural tools might struggle during military campaigns when demand shifted to weapons. Those focusing on luxury goods faced periodic downturns when economic conditions reduced discretionary spending. Urban blacksmiths also faced different regulatory environments than their rural counterparts. City authorities imposed strict rules about workshop locations, concerned about fire hazards from forges and coal storage. Noise ordinances limited working hours, particularly important for blacksmiths whose hammering could disturb entire neighborhoods. Quality regulations were more stringent, with guild inspectors regularly examining products and punishing substandard work. These regulations provided consumer protection and maintained the trade's reputation, but they also increased costs and limited flexibility. The social status of blacksmiths varied considerably across different regions and time periods. In areas with active mining industries, smiths who could work with exotic metals like brass or bronze enjoyed higher status than those limited to iron. Weaponsmiths generally ranked above toolmakers, reflecting the military values of medieval society. Master smiths in major commercial centres like London, Paris, or Florence could achieve wealth and influence comparable to successful merchants. But village smiths in remote areas might struggle to distinguish themselves from other manual labourers. Marriage patterns reveal much about blacksmiths' social standing and aspirations. Guild records show that master smiths frequently married within craft families, creating dynasties that controlled workshops for generations. These strategic marriages combined workshops, shared costs, and created mutual support networks. Successful smiths might marry daughters of merchants or minor nobles, using their wealth to purchase higher social status.